us Ray Batina. He's a macroeconomist at Washington State University in Poland. He's got quite a strong record of work in open economy macroeconomics. He's exploring topics for open economy macro. Today, he is presenting a paper that's not exactly the one that you had the title for. It's Capital Tax Competition and Social Security. Yes. Ray, how do you want to take questions? Would you like any questions at any time, or would you like questions of clarification?
Anything's fine. If I don't know the answer, I'll just make something up.
Very good. Carry on then. It's yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always fun to come to a new place and meet some people and talk about research ideas. Well, I'm from Washington State University. I'm on the faculty there. I've been there quite a while. Pac-Pens, Go Foods, and all that. I'm also supposed to ask you to donate money to us because the state no longer wants to. WSU is in Pullman, Washington, small college town, right near the border with Idaho. And the University of Idaho is in Moscow, Idaho, which is about 8 miles east of us. And there are 3 liquor stores. One small one in Pullman, 2 large ones in Moscow. The biggest one is strategically located right across from UI. Washington State imposes the highest taxes on liquor in the country. Maybe the world, for all I know. So you can see where I'm going with this. A bottle that costs, say, $12.95 in Idaho will run you over $20 in the state of Washington. So you can tell where people are going to go if they drink hard liquor. Except for, let's see, the town chocolate. The foreign students in Pullman who don't know where Moscow is. And that guy who can't figure out the bus schedule. That's about it. I was talking to the manager of the main store, and he said they don't have any business in Pullman. Okay? The point is that cross-border shopping is huge, and it is a big, difficult problem. And it sort of gives you a hint as to the kinds of problems that a state or local government can have in terms of imposing policies. Okay? Give you 2 examples from Portland. Yeah, there you go. 2 examples from Portland. I had a friend who moved from the main campus in Pullman to Vancouver. It must be at least 15 years ago. And after about 10 years, he and his wife built a big house. They bought a lot of land. And I guess it rains here? A lot. So they had this grass problem. So they came down to Portland to buy a riding lawnmower. And, of course, the reason they came down here was to save themselves several $100s in sales taxes, right? So they dutifully took it home, probably driving in the lawnmower lane. And eventually they filled out that little warranty card and sent it in. 3 months later, they got a notice from the tax authority in the state of Washington. They knew what they bought, where they bought it, when they bought it, and how much they paid for it. They calculated the tax and said, you are in violation of state statute, whatever it was. Send us the money immediately or else. And oh, by the way, don't do this again. Another example.
Go Washington.
I can do you better. You guys just raised your income tax, right?
Yeah.
How much did it go?
Only above the top $250,000.
Yeah, it has no effect on any of us.
So then you can donate to me without any guilt.
It's not worth it to me. My tax per pack's not that high.
Except, I read in the papers just 2 days ago that you have a migration out towards Vancouver. 3,000 people moved in 2009 and 15,000 moved last year. That's a huge increase. Okay? So I'm guessing that you gave the Tea Party contingent an incentive to leave the state. Is that it? Are you dumping them in our laps? We've already got problems.
Ray, is this how it's supposed to look, or should we be messing around?
That probably was not the income tax. Those weren't the people that moved, the ones that got the higher income tax here. That's not who moved over to Vancouver.
You know, a lot of people can't do math in the first place, these are tax increase.
Yeah.
Full screen mode hell.
Try page display and take off this continuous.
Our quarter millionaires weren't the ones
Take
that were
off the
flooding
what?
Vancouver. Recently.
Take off the single page.
But they
text.
can't have the tax.
No,
Right.
nobody
I think if you
did.
switch it just to single page,
Warren Buffett would.
not unchecked, single
Would
page.
you like to come up and do?
Right. It has nothing to do with your 2 years, but the extensive development of East Clark County is largely explained by the $450 million bridge which
Hit it with
attaches
a
to
single page.
Multnomah County.
Just
It's not a tax event, it's a spending event.
And adjust the zoom.
Yeah, and if you.
So we should call it the newspaper and tell
Where's
them
the
how to
AV
walk.
person?
No, the 2 years you're talking about, the bridge is there for both of those, I don't know what
Yeah.
that is. But in general, the big development of East Clark County is associated with the bridge, not with taxes.
Off the Zoom.
The tax difference has been the same from,
Try actual
Seven.
size.
Yeah, actual size probably would work. Why not?
Fit page, maybe?
We can go back to,
We should try, try backing out and then clicking up to see if
There you go, I like your ideas.
what, you got the print reader.
Well, that's perfect, that's all.
Is this good?
Yeah!
I think we were better off before.
Yeah.
You good with this? Okay, that's good, that's better.
that's what I was gonna
Wait,
suggest.
can anybody
next.
read it?
No.
No.
You want to sit down here?
A few,
There we go, that's bigger.
He's just gonna have a problem with advancing is all. Is this
That's
good
what
with
he
you?
needs to do. That's not fair.
I'll just stand it.
That's close.
Does it click
Oh.
through? I would like to have a little
That's
small
good.
discussion on why I still like overhead projectors. Did we ever have this trouble? We never did.
No, is this good now? Yeah, that's perfect. But it was okay before. So this raises the general, these kinds of examples where people are willing to move from one place to another on the basis of the tax system, or could be some other policy, really raises some serious questions about whether state and local governments can sort of deviate from the average, if you will. The general issue of policy competition has several parts to it, and this literature is taught, and it's just absolutely huge. There's some in regional science, there's some in international trade, macro guys are now interested in this. And so just to fix ideas, horizontal competition is competition between governments at the same level. So Oregon, 2 states imposing a sales tax, like Idaho or Washington or whatever. Vertical competition involves governments at different levels. Okay, and these are diametrically opposite to one another, and I'll show you why in a moment. And of course, like any externality, it can be harmful or it can be beneficial. And when you start studying, beneficial, I like this one. Illinois recently had to raise its income tax from 5% to 7%, which is a huge increase for them. And it's not even going to come close to solving their budget problems. If you don't like the governor of Wisconsin already, I'll give you another reason not to like him. As soon as the legislation was passed, Wisconsin began running ads on TV in Chicago, extolling the virtues of moving your company and yourself up to Wisconsin. Come to Wisconsin. And the behavior that's involved in some of this is exactly what you see when 2 states, 2 cities, or whatever, are competing for the same sports franchise. Okay? Or a large new production facility. Okay? About 20 years ago, Boeing was going to build a new facility, and there were all kinds of states and local governments that were competing for it, and so was GM Saturn division is another case in point. Okay, some really serious issues. Ireland purportedly lowered, actually dramatically lowered is corporate income tax rates and its capital income tax rates in the early 1990s. And there was a huge spurt in economic growth after that, so people draw a cause and effect relationship. And it also fueled a housing and construction boom and a banking boom that has all gone bust, taking the Irish economy way down. And it's gotten so bad that young people are graduating from college with no hope of getting a job. So they're actually emigrating to the continent and to US. Italy is a really good country to study. Whenever Italy got into trouble, headed into a recession, they would devalue their currency, making their imports more expensive and their exports cheaper. They would then sort of grow their way out using trade. Well, they can't do that anymore, can they? They're part of the union, and so they're stuck with the euro. And that's why it might take them a lot longer to get out of the trouble that they're in. And there are some environmental people here. I remember reading a story in The Economist quite a while ago, 2-3 years, about the Danube and how states that are downstream are really suffering from the pollution created upstream. And one of the recent trends in tax policy, and this goes back 25 years, is that taxes on capital have been falling, not just in Europe, by the way, but in the US and other countries. And they're being replaced by taxes on consumption and labor. And that's one of the general trends that we're seeing now. So future taxes on mobile resources will become increasingly hard to impose. And they'll shift somewhere else to less mobile resources. Now I'm just focusing here on the regional economics literature, but these are some of the classic papers in the early 80s. The first mention that I'm aware of is actually in a book, Fiscal Federalism, by Oates, and he just mentions the problem in passing. And we go almost 14 years before someone actually sits down and carefully writes out a model, and then tries to figure out what the channels of influence are. And that was the paper by Zodro and Miskowski, and a friend of mine, Jay Wilson, wrote a paper, and there's some others there. And some of the main results here: horizontal competition, literally government A raises its tax rate, okay, at location A. Some of its base shifts to B. So B is going to be better off for a number of reasons. If it's taxing that, then it's going to have more tax revenue, and it's sort of a fiscal dividend. If it's capital that's moving, there is a well-known fact that wages and capital are positively correlated. Okay? So their wages will be higher wherever that location is. So this positive externality strongly suggests that too little of this activity would be undertaken. And in this context, that means that the tax rate would be too low, and that would keep government spending low. Okay. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but this is what the model predicts. And vertical competition, government A and B are trying to tax the same thing, say for example income. Government A raises the tax rate, and the base is going to be reduced for B, so it's a negative externality. And then the theory of externalities tells us that too much of this activity will be undertaken, so the tax rate is too high, government spending is too high. So these two cases are sort of diametrically opposed to one another. One of the main results in the horizontal competition literature is that if the countries realize that the tax rate is too low, and hence spending on useful things that we assume people are gaining utility from is too low, then what they should do is get together, form a tax treaty to raise the capital tax rate some, and then spend the proceeds on things that improve welfare. Okay. One of the main results in these models, and I'll get to why in a moment, is that this kind of tax rate increase across all the different locations gets perfectly capitalized into the real interest rate. So if you raise the taxes by 10%, the real interest rate should drop by 10%. Okay, and I'll get to why in a moment. And it also improves welfare, for the reason I just gave you, if they spend the revenue on things that provide utility. And then there's some other things. Residence taxes are preferred to source-based taxes. A residence tax would be a tax on me, and if I have some sort of investment in Canada, an investment in Europe somewhere, then I would have to list all of these things on my tax form, and I might forget about them, or all of them. In other words, tax evasion under a residence principle is very easy to pull off. So it's very difficult for governments to impose residence taxes. So usually what they do is they impose a source tax. A source tax is what is right there in front of you. Okay. Oh, and then there are some results that intergovernmental transfers across countries can help to alleviate this problem. Okay, I'll just run through some. And I should probably point out that usually competition is a good thing, right? We're all economists and we believe in competition. But sometimes, because of the way the environment is configured and the way people interact, sometimes the group incentive and what comes out of that is better than what happens with individual incentives. And the prisoner's dilemma game is a perfect case. Okay, that's a structure where individual actions taken alone lead to one outcome, and everyone would be better off if they thought as a group and behaved accordingly. Okay, and that gives you sort of a flavor for this entire literature. Okay, well, one of the main results is that someone mentioned a bridge. One of the main results here is that governments don't just spend on general consumption spending, they also spend on public infrastructure. Okay? And if that improves productivity, then there might be an incentive when taxes are kept low to shift away from general government spending on things like libraries and education and things like that towards infrastructure. Okay? I don't know about your campus, but on our campus, it's always easy to sell building a new building rather than paying faculty a raise.
That's good to know.
I know, it's all my fault. It started in 1985 when I first got there. So we're talking about taxes on consumption and wages. A tax on consumption is almost the same as a tax on labor. That's actually really easy to show. A friend, Jay Wilson and Bukovetsky, have this result that a wage tax on immobile but endogenously chosen labor dominates a source-based tax. So if a government has a choice of taxing labor, even if the labor responds, but is immobile, okay, so you get hit with a tax and you just work less, that would dominate this tax on source-based capital. Now, before I said that a tax rate increase would get perfectly capitalized into the interest rate, and that's because capital in these early models was fixed. And so this third result, C, if you sort of broaden the model from a static framework to a dynamic framework, so that people are saving and using capital markets to smooth their consumption, then savings will respond to changes in factor prices. And in that case, a tax on capital will get partly shifted to labor. Okay? If capital is fixed in supply, then capital bears the full burden of any tax on it. And then there are some other results. Again, Jay Wilson was thinking in terms of, well, suppose mobility is costly. Question?
Yeah, I'm way out of date on this literature, but I know in the IO stuff, they start playing around more not with price competition like that, Bertrand, or more like Cournot. Is there any kind of tax harmonization that has to do with things like jobs targeting or investment targeting, rather than dealing with agreements about the capital tax rates and wage tax rates?
Okay, I'll jump ahead about an hour.
Okay.
In conclusion,
I'm sorry, I made a mistake not reading the paper.
there is a result.
Okay.
Where they talk about a package, and the package would be something like the following: you say to the body politic, we would like to raise the tax on whatever it is, even if it's mobile, and here's what we're going to spend it on. Guaranteed, we're going to write the law that way. Here's what the law is. Now let's agree to it. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I didn't mean to jump to the end of that.
No. And we actually tried that in the state of Washington. In the early 2000s, let's see, how did that go? Oh, they wanted to do it by referendum. So they were very clever about it. In every single county, there was at least one road project. And of course, King County is where all the population is, so they got more than their fair share. And they were going to raise the gas tax by 9 cents. Okay, 9 cents. And they said in the law exactly where they were going to spend it, when they were going to spend it, and so on. And I thought for sure that was a really smart thing to do. And it failed by 10 points, which is a landslide.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, the legislature passed it again. Just skip the people, skip the referendum, we'll just go straight and pass the law. And we undertook those projects and they finished them. And then probably half those people lost their jobs in the next election. One result that's particularly interesting to me is that if you have, say, J competitors here, and you add some, then that exacerbates the competition and the harmful impact that competition has here. So if the externality is a horizontal one, then taxes are too low. And if you add competitors to it, then taxes fall even more. And if it's a vertical...
Like more states around the border, or who are your competitors?
Easier move.
Could be countries in Europe, for example.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's, all right, so so if there was an extra, instead of just having an Idaho-Washington state border, if you had another state there, that's adding a competitor. If there were 3.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what you meant.
Oregon jumps in.
Or if you carve up the state of Washington, the Democrats and the Republicans,
Oh,
East versus West,
right.
that would do it too.
Would changing transfer costs change the competition equation too? For instance, in the state example, if it was easier to move between Canada and the US now, that would have the effect.
Yes, that's actually a very good example. Yeah, if you signed a treaty that allowed an increase in competition, for example, you gave everyone most favored trading state. So if they had that most favored status, then that would be an example of that.
Wagner's law would say that that point E was not correct for at least the first 175 years of American history, because we continuously added states and tax levels through that period.
Oh, he's wrong.
Who's wrong, right? Not likely.
That's a statistical correlation, right?
No, it's just history.
Well, but
But we do know we started with 13 states, we ended up with 50, and we do know the taxes raised through that period.
right, but you're not holding anything else constant, though.
Well, no, does life ever do that? I know models do, but does life?
Oh,
Well,
now
but
we're
the
there.
model gives us a hint as to how to test it and what to hold constant, and that's what's critically important here. So if you're not going to hold anything constant, then your model is vacuous, and you might as well go home early.
Well, what's held constant there?
Pardon me?
What's held constant there when your increased competition means?
Actually, I'm going to go through one of these models in great detail.
Okay,
So.
great.
Then the next result actually is a combination of results. There is this literature that looks at various kinds of growth models, including endogenous growth models, where the growth rate is literally endogenous and affected by all sorts of things. And Ken Judd had a paper, a famous one, in the 80s. Christoph Chanley had another famous paper, and Bob Lucas had his famous paper in 1990. And he draws a very tight correlation between the tax rate on capital and growth rates, negative correlation. And then Kothenberger and Lockwood applied it to tax competition. So if tax competition keeps the taxes on capital low, then that would spur growth. Okay. And then Asaf-Razin and Yun have a paper where they're interested in the convergence of growth rates across countries, which is a major issue in the macroeconomics literature. Okay, well, here we are. In the Zodro-Miskowski classic model, the static model, and this is the starting point, literally, for a lot of this work.
Can I ask you a question about the last slide? Back there with, I don't remember these papers, Lucas and everybody, but what data are they looking at? Because, again, you think this doesn't fit with history.
In Lucas's model, he models, and Dodge's growth model, where there's a balanced growth path. And he looks at per capita data, and he argues that the growth rate has been fairly constant for 50, 60 years.
But that when taxes are lower, the growth rate is lower.
In his model, so what he does is he shows you what the predictions of the model are, and then he shows you how to match it up with data, and then he simulates it. And once he simulates it, then you've got assumptions about the deep parameters of the model, the concavity of technology, and so on and so forth. And then once you've got all of that, then you can run experiments.
But he's not setting it up on historical data, is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
yeah, US data. Yeah. So he chooses the parameters to match the balanced growth path. That's actually in the data. Okay, and other people have replicated this for Europe. Okay, so imagine there are two regions, two countries, two locations. Capital is perfectly mobile, meaning there are absolutely no costs of moving it around. Labor is perfectly immobile. In each region, there's a measure of one space for consumers, measure of one for firms. So we can look at the representative consumer and the representative firms. They're all identical. So we're sort of abstracting from redistribution. So let's see, the technology is the classic constant returns to scale. So we know that economic profits are going to be zero in equilibrium. For the representative consumer, that's the utility function there for someone at location H. C is consumption of the private good, G is consumption of the public good. The person is endowed with 1 unit of labor, and then they're going to exchange it for a wage. KE is the capital endowment per worker, and that's fixed across all the different locations. And the equation there is just the budget constraint confronting this agent. So their consumption is just equal to their labor earnings plus their earnings on their capital endowment. So it's imagined that they have this endowment, and if there are J locations, here there's just 2, but if there are J locations, then you allocate your capital across those different locations so that the net of tax rates of return will arbitrage out. So they'll all be equal, okay, in equilibrium. And then we have a firm, and the firm is just maximizing profits there in choosing capital per worker. And so we get a first order condition that you can solve. And when you solve it, you get this capital demand function at the bottom. Capital demand is a function of the user cost of capital. And there is a cottage industry trying to figure out what that is, because in real countries it's very complicated. You have all kinds of write-offs for certain kinds of depreciation and so on and so forth. But the general idea is there. And it's downward sloping. Okay, so capital and the user costs are negatively correlated. And then since profits there at the top in the argmax there, since those are zero in equilibrium, the economic profit is zero, then you can solve that top equation for W, and then you substitute in the capital demand, and you get that local wage function. So that sort of tells us how the local wages will respond to various and sundry things. In this case, it's a tax on capital. And then I have the government's decision problem written down there. So the government, perfectly benevolent, so it's going to use the utility function of the representative consumer as its social welfare function. And that would be its budget constraint there. The tax rate T times K, which is the base here, and that'll be at least as great as how much it wants to spend. And that'll hold with equality at equilibrium. And then, this is kind of important, the way the game is usually set up, you take, the government is small relative to everything else. So it takes aggregate variables, like the real interest rate as given. And, more to the point here, it's going to take the policy, TG, of every other government as given. Okay. Sometimes it's been called a Nash policy equilibrium. Oh, and then this last equation here is the capital market equilibrium condition. So on the left-hand side, we have the total stock or total supply of capital, and it's fixed. And on the right-hand side, we have the total demand for it. And they didn't do this, but I'm going to do it. You can set this up as a two-stage game. It's kind of like a game of duopoly. Okay, we've got two firms. So governments in the first stage will simultaneously choose their policies, and then they will implement them, and they are committed to those policies. Okay. And then in the second stage of the game, private agents do whatever they're going to do. Okay. In a more complex model, they supply labor, they supply capital, and in this model, they allocate the capital across different locations. Okay. So that's sort of the gist of the model itself. And now what we want to do is manipulate that model to figure out what it can tell us about this whole issue. So when the government chooses its expenditures optimally and its tax policy optimally in the sense that I just described, when you manipulate those first order conditions, what you wind up with is this condition right here, and that's known as the modified Samuelson rule. For a pure public good, what's the Samuelson rule? Well, you just sum up all the marginal benefits and you choose G so that it's equal to the marginal cost of providing the good, which in this model is just 1. Notice here on the right, though, it's not 1. Theta is the ad valorem tax rate on capital, and E there is the elasticity of capital demand relative to the user cost. Okay? So what's happening here is that when one government imposes this capital tax, it's changing that user cost. And some of the capital is going to leave if it raises it. And that denominator there, theta times E, is capturing that impact on this rule. Okay? Now, theta and E are both positive. And when you subtract them from 1, the right-hand side there is bigger than 1. So the left-hand side is bigger than 1. And with the first best case, it's equal to 1. Okay? So if the marginal benefits of this public good are down sloping, they're negatively correlated with the public good because of marginal utility falling, then what that means is that you're spending too little on whatever this public good is. And the intuition is exactly what I gave you before. The more responsive the capital base is, so raise the tax rate, the more of it that leaves, the larger the right-hand side there, and the less you'll be spending on the public good. Okay? So that is the mathematical logic that supports the conclusion I gave you before. Now, in this model, one way of doing this is to sort of ask, well, suppose a collection of these countries or locations gets together and decides to all raise their tax. Okay, so they sign a tax treaty. And they decide that they're going to spend this money on what provides people with utility. So they go ahead and do that, and then this is the complete capitalization result where the interest rate drops 1 for 1 with the tax rate, and that's because the supply of capital is perfectly fixed to the whole economy. And all that's happening here is that people are allocating that capital across different sectors. So in this case, capital would be bearing the burden of the tax, and the reform causes direct and indirect welfare effects. But when you write out all the math, all the direct effects drop out, because you apply that Samuelson rule. And they drop out for the same reason that they drop out of an indirect utility function when you start differentiating that by the envelope theorem. So all that's left are these indirect effects, and in these models, those indirect effects always work through the real interest rate. Okay? And that's going to turn out to be really important later on when we get to a more complex model. And well, there's the equation right there. This tells you how welfare responds in this model. And you have T, the tax rate, UG over UC is just the marginal benefit of the public good relative to the numeraire. K sub R is the capital demand and how it responds. That would be a derivative there, and it's negative. And dr dt is -1. So that product there is positive. And that's just capturing the so-called spending effect.
So this pact that they have a pact, and does the pact produce a welfare gain which comes from the fact that they now actually produce more of the public good.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
good, let's do that.
Okay, so at the end of the seminar, I'm going to ask for donations. You can tell them it's for the football team because they really need help. I think they won 2 games last year. Okay, now I'm going to sort of shift gears and start talking about Social Security, because what I want to do is combine these ideas and figure out what happens when you try to have one of these capital tax reforms and you've got one of these complex Social Security systems. How will it affect the Social Security program, basically? And I was, for one of my classes, quite a while ago, I was searching for some interesting stuff on Social Security, and there is a mountain of information on the Social Security Administration's website. And I actually sort of found, completely by accident, the person who received check number 1. We passed the legislation in 1935, and one of the reasons that it took the Roosevelt administration 2 whole years to get this through was because healthcare was part of the original intention. And people were shouting, oh, that's going to socialize medicine, blah, blah, blah. And so they pulled that out, and then they passed the rest because, you know, this is the 1930s. So we have a housing crisis, people are getting kicked out of their houses, and so on and so forth. And so we passed the legislation in 1935, and originally it was supposed to be fully financed. So that means that you have to wait for contributions to flow in, build up these trust funds, and then pay out of those big funds. And it's, well, like water finding the low point. You give a politician a pot of gold and they're going to find ways to spend it. And in this case, they started spending 1940, okay? Well before they had much of a trust fund. So the checks are numbered 00-0000-001, and then a whole bunch of zeros and then 2, and so on. And so the person who got check number 1 is Ida Mae Fuller, and she paid in for several years at the going payroll tax rate, and her employer contributed the other half. So she had about a little bit less than $50 in contributions in her name. And she retired in 1940, and she lived 35 years, dying at the age of 100. And she received a total of $22,800 and plus dollars. Usually there's a gasp in the room when I say that number. You've heard this story before?
No, those are inflated dollars, that's why I'm not She gave up really good money.
So I calculated,
stories in my textbook.
I calculated this rate of return. I think it's 17 or 18% per year. So if someone comes to you and says, well, I got a sure deal, you can earn 18% year in and year out, they're probably either mob related, someone named Madoff, or you should run from them anyway. Okay? It's just too good to be true. And it's a typical problem with starting up a Social Security program, because the people who start initially getting benefits do really well. Then eventually the system settles down, and eventually if you go through a demographic transition like most of the industrial world is right now, then the rates of return really plummet. So I found out 2 things. I found some fascinating information on different Social Security programs worldwide. And it turns out that most countries in the world do have Social Security programs. That kind of surprised me a little bit. And there were 2 things that I discovered. First, many of the details are completely idiosyncratic to the local government and the local politics and so on and so forth, the local institutions. And, you know, does a survivor get benefits? Do you pay spouse benefits to a spouse that doesn't work, and so on and so forth? But there are some features that are perfectly common across most of these programs. So most of these programs are basically financed by taxes on labor, payroll tax. The benefits are generally tied to the worker's work history. So for the U.S. program, they'll take your entire work history, they'll kick out maybe 5 of the lowest earnings years, and then they'll take a complicated average of the rest, and then multiply it by another number to get your monthly benefit. So your future Social Security benefit depends on your work supply right now. The more you work, the more you'll get, holding everything else constant, like the survival of the program.
And you can get that off their website back in about 30 seconds when you just put in your social security number, because I just did it because I'll turn 65 this month.
Congratulations. Is that a good thing?
The number was very pleasing. I don't want the program to go away.
And many countries also include a universal lump sum benefit. And in reading about this, that's one of the reasons for that is that they want to provide a basic minimum for anybody living in the country. Okay, there are some people who don't have much of a work history. And in the United States, we do something similar. It's supplemental security income, SSI. So if someone is born with mental difficulties, for example, and can't work at all, or if a teenager is in a car accident before they even hit the labor market and can never work, okay, they would get a Social Security benefit through that program. These are the features that I'm going to put in the model, and it's these features that also possibly cause an externality themselves. So, for example, if you raise the payroll tax, don't change anything else, then people will probably save less because of a wealth effect today, income effect today. If you tell them and convince them that their future benefit is going to be higher, then they'll also have less of an incentive to save. So if you introduce this kind of a program, or you increase it gradually over time, like we did in the 60s and early 70s, it's possible that people could save less. And then if the country is large enough, and the U.S. probably is, that might have a negative effect on world capital supply. And so that would spill over to other countries in the form of lower wages or possibly lower growth. And that's one of the stories that Martin Feldstein was really big on trumpeting in the 70s and 80s. And there is not a large literature, but there is a literature on this. And these are some of the big papers there, and I won't go through them. These are some of the main things, though. Much of this literature concludes that pay-as-you-go systems where money is flowing into the system and then almost immediately being paid out has a detrimental impact on savings, and that capital markets can be affected by this. And this is the logic that I just gave you. If the country I increases its tax rate, or if it increases its benefit rate, or it just makes its program bigger in both regards, then that might reduce savings and world capital as a result. And that would spill over to country J and so on. So, again, this is a negative externality. So if this country that's causing this ignores it, then probably whatever it's doing too much of. So the program would be considered too large by that measure because of this negative externality. And another major conclusion of this literature is that switching to a fully funded program will increase capital accumulation and wages. Okay. I didn't write the third one down. You don't want to do that right before the stock market crashes. You want to wait until after the crash, so the prices are really low. One of the main problems in the literature that I just cited is that there's no actual reason in the model for Social Security to be there. It's not really solving anything. Okay? So they take a growth model, and then they just add a payroll tax, add a benefit, and then they play around with the model. Okay? But you know, if that were the real world, then we wouldn't really need Social Security, right? People understand how to save, they have enough income to save, they then go and save for their own retirement, or their kids' college, or whatever it is. So I'm going to include a real reason for Social Security to be in the program, or for the program to be in the economy to begin with. And we'll see where we can go with that. And this is partly based on what's known as dynamically inconsistent preferences. So I'm an early morning person, so I like to get up and go for a fast walk around the block. It takes about half an hour if I go really fast. And when I get home, I always say to myself, I'm going to try and get more exercise later today. But then later today arrives, my preferences are different, and I don't. So I'm working on something or whatever it is, so I don't get the extra exercise. And then the next day, I just repeat. Okay? So my preferences in the morning are different than my preferences in the afternoon when the afternoon arrives. And the same thing is true for probably everybody in this room on January 2nd. Okay, what happens on January 2nd after you've recovered from the debaucheries of 2 evenings before? Well, you say to yourself, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to eat better, I'm going to get more exercise, I'm going to stop drinking, etc., etc. How long does it last?
A week.
Okay, so within a week, your preferences have changed, and you've got the same problem.
That's good.
Feldstein was the first one to really work with this kind of model, although the ideas have been floating around for quite a while before this. And his, well, it's right there. He has a closed economy. There's only one policy. The benefit is lump sum, and it does not depend on wages. And he only looks at the steady state. And the paper by Kremer is mostly interested in redistribution. Okay. So now we finally get to my model with all of that as prelude. We're going to be here all week. So I'm going to work with the standard overlapping generations model. For those who don't know, it works like the following. The economy lasts forever, time is discrete. So literally, t equals 1, 2, 3, and so on. Every time period, a new generation is born, and it lasts for 2 periods, young and old. And then in the third period, it leaves the stage. First period, it's endowed with labor. So in the first period of life, when it's young, that generation is going to work and save and do whatever. Then the next period, it becomes old, and it receives its capital returns. Okay? And in this model, anyway, of capital mobility, it's then going to decide where to move that capital so as to equate rates of return and equilibrium. Okay, so this is a combination of an overlapping generations model with the Zodro-Miskowski framework with myopic agents that I'll call spenders. Okay. The population, there's one consumption good, just like in Zodro and Miskowski. There's population growth, which is more general than their model. And I'm going to assume, this is kind of problematic, I suppose, that you could have this be one government imposing all these policies, or you could have it be 2 government agencies imposing separate policies. And it literally doesn't matter, and I'll show you why later on. So tau is the tax on capital, G is the public good for what I'll call the general tax authority. Gamma is the payroll tax rate, and beta is the replacement rate. Okay, and the 2 kinds of agents, we have some life cycle agents, and the fraction that they make up is phi. The spenders, who don't save anything, that's 1 minus phi. The utility function of the spender is right there, and I'm just assuming it's separable, but you don't really need that. So C1 is their consumption in the first period when they're young. C2 is the consumption when they're old, and that occurs 1 period hence. GT is the public good that they enjoy now in the first period of time t, and GT plus 1 is what they get next period. And they have the same kind of labor endowment, so they have 1 unit in the first period when they're young, and they have none when they're old. So I'm forcing them to be retired, and that also doesn't matter. We could have them choose the length of their work life, and nothing here would change, or not much would change. And now here's the kicker for the spender. Ex ante, at the beginning of their life cycle, that's their utility function right there. So they care about C1, and they care about G that they're going to get today, and they don't recognize the future at all. So they're literally living in the moment. So that would be the Buddhist in this model. Then ex post, at the end of the first period, they say to themselves, oh my God, I can't work anymore. I should have saved something. And so then they get their true utility function, which is very similar to, in fact, the same as the life cycle agent. Okay. So literally, this person, and there is some tension in this literature. It's unclear, and I don't think it's even testable, whether you can tell why someone doesn't save. Do they just believe that they don't want to save and they're going to work until they die? Are they thinking that they can rely solely on Social Security benefits? I'm not sure what the thinking is, and I don't think you could actually separate it out to test it. So usually people, and this is related to that large literature on hyperbolic discounting, Leibson and those guys. And apparently these kinds of models can get at certain anomalous behaviors. Richard Thaler has documented that empirically. Okay, so now we come to the budget constraints, and they're basically the same for the two types, except...
When you make your welfare evaluation of the outcome.
Yeah, I know where you're going. Excellent question. I've answered it before. I am following the literature and doing what the referees told me to do.
Okay, what did they tell you?
They told me to use the ex post function. Because, and my justification in trying to explain it to another referee, this paper has been in limbo for a while. I have referees who are arguing with each other through me.
You're cooked.
Yeah, I know, I'm actually thinking about pulling the paper, but the reason that the problem exists is because the ex-ante function is being used by the agent itself. If you want to try to solve the problem, then to evaluate the person's true welfare gains, you would want to use the ex post function. So it's a leap of faith that they would have the same preferences if they really understood things. So, actually, yeah, that might have an impact. Any other? Yeah.
So these agents realize that when they're young, they're going to get this GT, right? This is government.
General government spending, yeah.
Yes. Would it matter if they also realize when they're young they are going to get GT plus 1?
For which type?
For whatever you do, does it matter? If ex-ante you also add plus B of GT plus 1. So they...
To the ex-ante function?
Yes. It doesn't matter. So they just, they don't want to save on their own, but they realize that they are going to get this Social Security thing.
No, that won't matter. No. If I understand your question correctly, you want to add to the ex-ante function their utility from the public good thanks period?
Yes.
No, that won't matter because it'll be picked up in the function that I'm actually using to represent the preferences.
Okay.
So the V of GT plus 1 is going to be in the social welfare function when the governments are choosing their policies. Yeah. That's a good question. So the budget constraints here, we have 1 minus gamma times W, so that would be the disposable income after the payroll tax. C1 is consumption of the first period, S is savings. Then in the next period, you're going to get your savings plus the return on the savings. Then you get alpha, which is the universal benefit, and beta is the replacement rate times the wage, okay, labor income in the second period, minus your second period consumption. Now, some people in other seminars that I've given this to have asked the obvious question, is the government's decision problem itself time inconsistent? Because there's a huge literature on that. I can tell you this, because I did a paper on it. Notice that this is the wage last period, okay? And in an extended model where the person is choosing their labor supply, then it would be, say, WT times LT, where that's their labor supply. But that happened in the previous period, okay? So in that case, the government's decision problem might not be recursive. So in that case, the government's policy would not be recursive. So what happens is, I can probably illustrate with the capital tax levy. Imagine a world where there's 2 periods. In the first period, the government promises to tax capital at a very low rate. Then in the second period, agents save, and then they pay their taxes, okay? That's kind of what's going on here. Now, if the government can re-optimize after the agents have saved their capital and the capital is now fixed, then they'll raise the tax rate on it. And that's just a simple application of the so-called Ramsey rule. That would happen here in this context if labor supply were being chosen. It depends on your current work history. So you're setting yourself up, and then when your work history is done and you're actually receiving your benefit, now it's inelastic. Okay, and that would change the government's choice of beta. But that's not going to happen here because labor supply is fixed. So out of all this, what we get is a savings function there at the bottom. So savings depends on income in the first period, income in the second period, which is also from Social Security, aside from the savings, and the interest rate. And you can show very easily by differentiating the heck out of the first order conditions that savings is increasing in first period income, decreasing in future income. Okay, obviously if you think you're going to have more wealth in the future, you'll save less now. And increasing in the interest rate. The firms are exactly like in Zodro and Miskowski. So they're maximizing profit, and we're going to get out of that exactly what we got from ZM's model, the wage function and the demand for capital. And these are the equilibrium conditions for the capital market. On the left hand, in the first equation there, this is at time 1, and notice it says S0. So that's for the initial old generation who's already done their savings. So on the left-hand side of that first equation, capital is fixed in supply. Okay? And then we have on the right-hand side the demand for that capital across all the different locations. And then the next equation in the middle there is the equation that governs everything that happens after that. Okay? Time 2, time 3, and time 4. And that just says that now savings is endogenous to the model. Agents are choosing their life. The life cycle agents are choosing their saving optimally. And then the right-hand side is of the same form. And then below that, when we assume a lot of this, some of these models really blow up on you when there's too much going on in them. So to get some intuition into what's going on, many people have used this symmetry assumption. And we're going to be mostly interested in two things. One, what happens in the initial period, and two, what happens in the steady state. Okay, so this last equation will play a big role in that. And here's the social welfare function, and it's fairly standard in this literature. So society's welfare depends on the Bentham sum of all these different generations' utilities. Okay, so V super naught there is the initial old guys. And that very first term with the phi in front of it, those are the savers. They're the guys who have the capital. And then the 1 minus phi term with the asterisk there, those are the spenders in the first old generation. And there's 1 over 1 plus n fewer of them. And then on the right-hand side, we have all the future generations. And this is the kind of function that people have used in these open control problems since at least Arrow and Kurz is famous both in the late 1970s, I guess, or mid-1970s. And then again, there are the two budget constraints for the General Tax Authority and then the Social Security Administration down below that. And so here's how this game is typically set up, and I'm following that. At time 0, before the economy starts, the governments are going to choose an entire sequence, an infinite sequence, for their policy now and into the infinite future. And they're going to be absolutely committed to it. And so what we're after here is studying the optimal policy rule that a government would follow in this case. Okay? Then, as time proceeds, within the period, the government actually implements part of the rule at the beginning of the period. Okay, and that's set in stone. And then the old guys decide how to allocate their capital across the different locations, just like in the ZM model. And then the young guys are saving, and the old guys combine their capital with the labor of the young guys to produce the output, pay wages, everybody pays their taxes and receives the Social Security benefits when they're supposed to. Okay. I think these are time consistent as long as you maintain that timing convention within the period. So if you write down the first order conditions at time 0 for time j, and then at time j, write down the same condition for j, they'll be the same.
So they're forcing it to be pay-as-you-go. Is this what is that a constraint or is that an equilibrium result?
That's the constraint.
Thank you.
So each taxing authority has to balance its budget each period.
Each period. There's no borrowing. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying, I've actually worked bonds into this, and it gets,
A little uglier?
We could think of our dreams.
it depends on what the government's gonna do.
Okay.
Actually, to take your question completely seriously.
Okay, yeah, I was just,
Sometimes when the government can choose the path for debt, that'll change the growth path of the economy to the efficient path. And I'm gonna assume that it's already there. That the path that it's following is efficient. What I wanna do is focus on how capital tax policy is directly affecting the Social Security program. So I don't want all these other things going on.
I'm not going to understand the next 20 minutes. It's okay. Thank you.
Okay, so in conclusion, deja vu, we've done this before. You get, okay, when you work through all the math in a steady state, you get that equation right there, the so-called spending rule, and this generalizes the modified Samuelson rule from before. On the left-hand side, you have the sum of the benefits. So M1 is for the young guys, M2 is for the old guys, and then you've got the savers in the first term, the spenders in the second term. So that's mimicking what was in Zodra and Laskowski's formula. And on the right-hand side, we have 1 over 1 minus theta times E, which is exactly what they got. And that captures the efficiency or the responsiveness of the capital demand across the different locations. And then with Social Security, though, you get two new terms. You get the yellow term and you get the blue term. The yellow term is coming from the following experiment. Suppose that you raise the tax rate on capital and the wage falls by 1 unit. Then the person saves gamma on their payroll tax liability. They're better off for that. But they also lose benefits beta. And we're taking the present value there. And when you work through the math and the Social Security constraints, you can show that that yellow term is negative. The blue term, the R star there is the, let's see, that's the marching utility of second period consumption over first period, and you're making a comparison between the spender and the saver there. And R star is going to be bigger than R. Partly, you're making the spender better off, but at the expense of the saver. And what you can show is that that's positive and the yellow term is negative, so they're working in opposite directions. You might say, well, so what? Well, even if they were to completely cancel, you'd still be stuck with all these distortions. And you might consider seriously looking for ways to reform the systems to improve welfare. And then at the bottom there you get the Social Security rule for choosing gamma and beta. And right here this just says, take an average of the margin utility of first period consumption across the different types and set that equal to the same average for the old guys. Okay, so that's comparing the margin utilities for the young guys for the consumption good and the old guys for the consumption good. Now, here's again a replication of the classic tax reform policy. So we would be taking the tax rate on capital at all locations at all time periods. Okay, so this is more extensive than Zodra and Laskowski. And saying we're going to increase the tax rate across all these locations and then spend the revenue and see what happens. And what we're after are figuring out the different channels of the welfare effects that such a policy response could create. And in the analytical part of the paper, I assume that the payroll tax rate can adjust so as to balance the Social Security budget. When I get to the simulations, I'm going to assume that the Social Security Administration is responding to this tax policy optimally. So it's going to adjust both gamma and beta, and it's going to follow its optimal rules. So in the first period of the response, since capital of the old guys is fixed, then we're going to get the same, intuitively, we should get the same result as Zodra and Laskowski because capital is fixed in their model, and we do. So you get complete capitalization of the tax change in the real interest rate. The wage doesn't change, just like in Zodro and Witkowski, and an extension, the payroll tax doesn't change. Now, what happens in time period 2? Well, now savings is endogenous, so it's going to respond to the changes in relative prices, namely the wage and the interest rate. So we know intuitively that the interest rate is not going to fall 1 for 1. So that means labor is going to share in some of the burden of this change in capital tax policy. And capital is being damped down at all locations. So what's going to happen is that there will be less capital demand. Okay, this is a shifting down of the demand curve. And so the wage would be negatively affected in all locations. Now, what happens to a Social Security program at a moment in time when the wage falls? Well, that's your tax revenue source. That's your payroll tax rate. So if the wage falls, then you have to raise the payroll tax rate to recover the revenue. Or you have to reduce the benefit rate. And if you reduce the benefit rate, old people will riot. You know, very slowly, but they'll riot. So that explains that last result at the bottom there. And then you can use standard techniques and figure out exactly what happens on the transition path. So the interest rate will fall, but the magnitude of the decrease gets smaller. And then you can see the rest of the results there. As with the other literature, the earlier literature, there are direct effects and indirect effects of this reform. All the direct effects mechanically drop out when you use the government's first order conditions by use of the envelope theorem. So all that's left for the welfare effects are working indirectly through the interest rate, the world interest rate as it changes. And so you get a current spending effect for everyone. Okay? So everyone would be better off if more were spent on this public good as long as they think they benefit from public spending. The young guys are also going to benefit in their second period because they're going to get more spending on goods that they like from the government as well. Now, when the interest rate falls, what's the indirect effect going to be? Well, when the interest rate falls, that means the capital is now cheaper relative to labor. And that will increase the amount of capital that firms want to use indirectly. So that increase in the capital indirectly will cause the wage to rise indirectly. And that provides another benefit. Now, in this paper, I'm assuming that the payroll tax revenue dominates at the margin in terms of the benefit, okay, which seems like a reasonable assumption to me. And so when the wage changes, it has more of an impact on payroll tax revenues than it does on benefits. Okay. And this is really important. The interest rate effect is going to hit the savers, but not the spenders, because the spenders aren't saving anything. So when you sort of sum up everything that's going period by period, this is what it looks like. For the initial old spender, they're only affected by the spending effect, so they're better off unambiguously. For the initial old saver, they get the spending effect.
Remind us what better off from, what's the change that you're...
The tax rate is going up under a tax treaty.
Okay.
Across all the different locations.
Okay.
Now and into the future.
Capital tax rate.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the Zodro and Witkowski experiment. Then you have the initial young spender, and they're going to have the spending effect now and when they're old. So right away, this model is going to tell us that the initial young spender is going to be better off than the initial old spender. And then the initial young saver has two positive effects there, but they're going to get hit with this interest income effect that is bad for them. And then you're going to get similar effects for future generations and in the steady state. For the spender, he's going to have these three effects: the spending effect, future spending effect, positive wage effect, and then the negative Social Security wage effect. And the saver is like the spender, except they also have the interest income effect. So we can take a guess, and educated guess, and say that the saver here is going to be less well off than the spender. Okay? So one of the things that I discovered here is that spenders love this. They're always going to be better off for the most part. So you can use a classical methodology here for a simulation calibrated model. Neoclassical Cobb-Douglas technology, log linear utility. The parameters are listed there from the technology and the utility function. N is the population growth rate, B is the discount rate, and so on. And then there are different ways of choosing these different parameters. So one is that you have a data set that you want to mimic, and then you would choose the parameters to mimic that data set. Another would be to follow Auerbach and Kotlikoff in a large literature and just choose what you think are reasonable parameters. So for example, the labor earnings share is about 2/3, and that covers a lot of aggregate data. Annual interest rate, it could be anywhere from 3% to 4%. It turns out that doesn't matter. Then the benefit ratio, G over Y, that's government spending over GDP, and I chose 10% here. So this would be the percent of spending financed through the capital tax. And there is some work by guys like Slemrod and those guys, Slemrod Gordon, and a couple of other people that have found that it's 8 to 12%, so 10% an average. We're coming close to the conclusion. Okay, so the baseline is the first row there, and after the 20%, I simulated a 20% increase in the tax rate, and you can see the interest rate drops, which is what we hoped it would do, and it did. The wage falls a little bit. The capital tax rate goes up by definition of the experiment. But notice the payroll tax rate goes up and the benefit rate goes up. That kind of surprised me. I was hoping the payroll tax rate would go up, but it really surprised me that the benefit rate also went up. So the capital tax reform is causing the Social Security program to get a little bit larger at the margin. And then the welfare effects from the reform, notice that the spender there, the initial old spender, is much better off, and the initial old saver is actually worse off. Okay? And that was really hard to make positive. The initial young spender is much better off than the initial young saver, which is what we thought, and the initial young spender is better off than the initial old spender because they've got those extra positive effects. And then in the steady state, they're both smaller, which is also what we were expecting from the theory. And so one conclusion right here is that savers are going to be less well off because of the general equilibrium effects here, and spenders are always going to be much better off because of this tax policy. And here I'm doing sort of a sensitivity analysis. I chose the population growth rate to match the US Census data from 1900 until recently. This simulation at the bottom there is with zero population growth. Many countries in Eastern, Western Europe, Japan, United States, and so on are now at or below replacement population growth rates, meaning that their populations are going to start shrinking. So n here being 0, if you look at the top row there, which replicates table 1, the bottom row is always smaller. So the benefit effects of this capital tax reform are going to be much lower in countries that have lower population growth. Well, here's future research. These two bottom ones, actually, this one right here is the one that I thought I was going to be done with to present. Obviously not. So one of the things that I was interested in thinking about is what would happen in this very same model if you simulate a reduction in the social safety net. So imagine that we dramatically reduce the benefits of Social Security as is currently being discussed. What would happen? Okay, that's one of the things that I'm kind of interested in. If savings responds positively, so there's more capital being accumulated as we do this, then there will actually be a fiscal dividend for the other government agency. Okay, the capital is the base for the other agency. So the capital goes up, you're going to get more revenue. Another thing that you can show, all of the welfare effects from that bottom row there are reversed in sign. All the positives are negative, and the negative number is positive, using the same parameters in the simulations, same assumptions. One of the things that we might have a problem with is that the Federal Reserve has pumped trillions of dollars into the economy, and much of it is just kind of sitting around not doing a whole lot. So that got me thinking, well, what happens in this model when we start trying to work money into it? And it kind of gets a little bit complicated. In fact, I don't use this model for that purpose, but I use a different model. And let's see. If a capital tax reform like this reduces demand for capital, reduces the capital intensity of production, then that could cause inflation through the so-called quantity theory of money. If the stock of money is fixed or growing at a certain rate, and agents are accumulating less of all assets, then the only way to reduce that real stock of money is to inflate. And this gets much worse when you have nominal bonds in the models.
What about a mild weakening where the government taxing authority and the social welfare authority, I can't remember what it's called again, the Social Security one, if they have a joint figure rather than...
Yeah.
So you combine the two constraints, so it's a joint pay-go rather than individual constraints for each one of the two authorities. Right. And that way there could be kind of a savings that goes on there too, which is...
What you can show
is
that, notice in the wage appears in the payroll tax revenue and the benefit, right?
Okay.
So the wage is going to respond to that change in the capital tax rate. What you get out of that is another term in the denominator here, and it's negative. So that makes the social marginal cost of producing the public good go up. So you produce less of the public good. Why? Because it's all of a sudden becoming harder to finance those payments. Okay, the payroll tax in that more general framework where you just have one constraint would be a major source of revenue for everything.
Okay.
Okay, and by raising the capital tax, you're reducing the wage.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
So what is the fraction of spenders and savers?
So what?
What's the fraction of spenders?
In the simulations?
Yeah.
You know, it was really surprising to me. That didn't make much difference.
Okay.
Let's see. Do I have it listed here?
You either get older, you die.
I think in these it was 65% savers,
65.
65%, 35% spenders. And let's see, I think I had to take it well down to like 40%. And when I did that, the results started to go wacky, and the model didn't converge.
So the more spenders, then it becomes kind of
Yeah,
too much.
Right, and that's because you don't have enough capital being accumulated in the economy. Okay. And in fact, you're not going to be able, with too little capital, you're not going to be able to generate these numbers there.
Okay. And another question. So you have these spenders and savers, and you have this anti-exposed utility.
Right.
Why did you choose to, so this is your motivation to have this social security, right?
Right.
I understood, okay. So why do you choose to have this kind of utility function? Well, I'm looking with my students in graduate class, just simple OLG, and when the population growth rate is greater than the real interest rate, it works. It's beneficial to have social security. So why did you have to introduce this specific utility function rather than doing this just simple?
The only place where the difference in utility functions comes in would be in the savings. And the other way to do it would be to have different preferences for the two agents.
Yes.
And for the spender, there's a corner solution naturally at the corner where they choose not to save.
Okay.
So the indifference curves would then be very, very steep there. Okay. That's actually more in line with the hyperbolic discounting literature, because they have that extra parameter in the future, and then when the future starts to arrive, the parameter goes away, right? And this would be the extreme case of that. But with the more general function that you're talking about, you just then you just have to worry about what happens at the margin if the program gets really big or really small. So if the spender is choosing not to save because they're at that corner, and you reduce the wage, it's less likely they'll save. And that's kind of what's going on there.
I'm sorry to cut in here. I'm afraid we're at the end of our time, and I'm going to ask you guys if you could, if you have any questions for Professor Batina, you could ask individually, and I could ask those of you who I would like to fill out a course evaluation form. If you would do that before we run off.
I didn't think I was going to get that far. I did when I presented this to my department.
You did well. You did very well.
There's no other coordination.
It's a